I'm Brock Yates. This is pretty familiar territory for the man we're going to meet today, one of the most multi-talented individuals in the sport of automobile racing. In fact, he lives just a chip shot away from here. Join me as we meet Ned Jarrett, one of the great drivers. Ned Jarrett was perhaps the first modern stock car driver. His prime years were in the early 1960s, when the major automobile factories became deeply involved in stock car competition. His racing accomplishments are many: 50 Grand National wins, including the prestigious Southern 500 at Darlington, South Carolina, and 2 NASCAR Grand National Championships, all achieved in a relatively short career spanning less than 7 years. It was Jarrett who, perhaps before anyone else, understood the sponsor's needs for articulate spokesmen both on and off the racetrack. Through a great effort, he overcame a childhood reticence to become perhaps the most articulate spokesman for the sport. Following his retirement in 1966, Ned Jarrett has become a familiar figure for racing audiences on both radio and television. By golly, I was ready to caddy with you all the way around here.
Well, I'll tell you, Brock, I think that I was a better race driver than I am a golfer. If not, I'd probably been dead a long time ago.
Well, your reputation on the golf course is pretty tough. I've heard you can play this game pretty darn good.
Well, I'll tell you, when you're around some of the people in racing, and particularly those here at this club, you better be pretty good or they'll get in your pocketbook if you aren't careful.
Did you think that it was going to... Did you think as you got out of the race cars that you were going to have more time to spend on a golf course and relax a little bit?
You know, that was a dream. Thought that I would be able to. Actually, I didn't start playing golf until I was about ready to retire as a driver, but I looked at this as something that I could spend a lot of time and relax, and it is something, too, that the whole family does and that we could do together. But it really hasn't worked out that way as you get deeper and deeper involved in the sport in other ways.
Well, the family, I know Martha plays, your wife, and Glenn and Dale both play, but Dale is pretty darn good at the game. I mean, he's serious.
Yes, he is. I believe that he could have made it on the Pro Tour if he had really worked at it. He has a lot of God-given talent as an athlete. He played just about every sport in high school, and golf, I think he excelled more than others. But then once he got behind the wheel of that race car for the first time, then all of that other went out the window, and that's all he wanted to do. And I guess I had to expect it because growing up in the sport, from the time they were born practically till now, they've been around race cars and racetracks and racing people, and that's not all bad.
No, it isn't. His dad behaved a little bit like that when he was a kid, too, and once he got in a race car, there wasn't much else on his mind, was there?
Well, that's true, although I didn't have the opportunities in school that the kids have today because I went to country high school, and they didn't have a very good athletic program. And I thought that I had some athletic ability and wanted to play in whatever sport that I could, but was not good enough at any of those to excel to any degree. Having grown up on the farm and working at a sawmill and around machinery, though, I think that sort of developed into auto racing because a desire for competition, a love for machinery, you just put them together and it comes out to be racing.
In retrospect, an extraordinary career in Grand National Racing, less than 7 years in the big leagues, as it were, 50 victories. That's 7th highest in the all-time list. You really came in and just went through the sport like a cyclone, and yet you retired at age 34, almost at the peak of your career.
I think most of us back then, Brock, was comparing ourselves with other athletes. Most of the time when they reach their mid-30s, they think, well, you know, they're getting over the hill with the young people coming along. But we were not taking into consideration that the sport of auto racing is so different, the athletes here. The experience that you gain more than offsets any vigor or enthusiasm that you may have as a younger person and helps to make you a better race driver. But we didn't realize that at that time because it was early in the sport and we had not had that many people to retire. So there were a number of us that retired at about that same time: Junior Johnson, Fred Lorenzen, and Marvin Tanch, and we were still all in our 30s.
Incredible, because theoretically you could still be actively racing. I mean, there are guys that you certainly you raced against that are not a whole lot younger than you are. I can think of a number of them.
Well, a lot of people doesn't realize the fact that Richard Petty actually started Grand National racing about 6 months before I did. David Pearson started at approximately the same time, and both of those are still going very strong. So you're right, you still could be, and I like to feel that I could be one of those drivers that could still be out there doing it. I didn't retire because I felt that I didn't have the physical ability to do it any longer. I'm a goal setter, and I set certain goals for myself, vowed that I'd never go down the other side. However far up the ladder I got, I'd quit while I was there. And so once I reached those goals, and of course there were some other considerations too, but the goal thing was certainly one thing, then I decided to retire and look for other challenges, and that's what the sport of auto racing was to me to begin with.
Well, now, you Grand National champion twice. As I said earlier, 50 victories. What other goals had you set in the sport?
Well, of course, one was to win the Grand National Championship. Numbers of victory was not one of the goals. As a matter of fact, when I retired, I didn't even realize how many races I'd won. Just they simply didn't keep track of them the way that they do today. But one of the goals that I did set for myself was to win the Southern 500 at Darlington. It's the oldest 500-mile stock car race and still has a lot of tradition with it, and I think every race driver yet today would like to win that.
And maybe the toughest of the super speedways in terms of a just sheer driving skill, perhaps.
Certainly it was back in the days when I was racing, and I think that if you talk to the modern day racers that they would say basically the same thing. It is a tough racetrack, and on any given day it'll just jump up and get you, so that presents a real challenge.
Had you set a timetable for yourself? In other words, when you retired, was it an impulse thing, or had you said, I will retire at the end of the 1966 season?
No, not really. I didn't, when I went into racing, I didn't say that I would be here for a certain number of years. The things began to happen that started my thinking in that direction. And I will have to say that in 1966, of course, I was in racing when the factories were in full-fledged, and I was on the Ford factory team. But there were a lot of pressures involved with that, and also the factories would use their clout, so to speak. If they had 6 or 7 guys under contract and they didn't like the way the rules were, well, you know, they might take their toys and go home. And we had that type of a situation in 1966, and I began to think, hey, I'm sitting here in a position that somebody can just wave me around the way that they want to. You know, I'm a puppet to some degree. And growing up in the atmosphere that I did, I didn't appreciate that. Now, I'm not hard-nosed against it. I can appreciate the fact that you have to go along with those that are helping to pay the bills, but at the same time, you don't want to be a puppet. And so that helped to start my thinking in another direction.
The Grand National schedule in the middle 1960s was substantially different than it is now. Was it longer or shorter in terms of races? And what about the mix of speedways in those days?
Well, of course, there was a bigger variety of speedways because we were racing on dirt tracks, short asphalt, even down to the quarter-milers like Islip, New York, Bowman Gray Stadium in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And still, the super speedways were coming into play. Daytona, of course, was opened in '59, Charlotte and Atlanta in 1960. So there was a bigger variety of speedways and conditions that we were racing under then. Also, the schedule was longer. We were running from 50 to 60 races per year, which meant that many times we would run 2 or 3 times a week. But the big difference was in many of those races, they were 100-milers, and you move into the track, practice, qualify, run your race that night, pack up and go home. So it was not like the situation now where 30 races, you go there several days in advance and having to spend a lot more time with them.
Ned, what about the fatigue levels of driving the cars that you ran 15 years ago versus the race cars of today?
Well, I think there are points that could be argued on either side. The cars that we were driving were much bigger and heavier. We didn't have the wide, slick tires that we have on the race cars today, and we didn't have spoilers. We didn't even know what spoilers were. And that had to make the cars harder to drive. And so from a fatigue level, certainly it required a lot of physical strength. But today, the cars might be easier to steer, but the fact that the heat is much greater inside the cars today, that puts an extra burden on the physical aspect of the driving. because the exhaust pipes are closer to the floor on the car. They're turning them like 8,000 RPM, creating a lot more heat from the engines than they did back then, and the cars are lower to the ground so the heat doesn't dissipate the way that it did on the cars that I was driving. So when you weigh one against the other, I guess really there isn't that much difference in the physical strength.
So it's always been tough, I guess, in a race car, no matter what kind of car it is or what kind of I guess it all tends to even out.
Yes, it does. Any race that you go to, there is a lot of competition in it. And you got to run hard, and you got to do a lot of things in order to win a given race. I can't see that that has changed that much over the years. Of course, today, with the sophistication that we have built into the cars and the durability that we see today in the cars, makes you have to make a little different approach than maybe when I was racing. You had to not only be a good physical race driver back then, but you had to be smart. You have to be the same way today, but you do have to charge more from the beginning to the end today than you did back then. The equipment wouldn't stand it if you drove it hard all the way, so you had to be smart enough to know exactly how much punishment you could put on your equipment and expect to be there at the end of a 500-mile race.
Ned, take us back to a piece of history a few years ago down the road. You're living on a farm with a family. Where did that automotive bug first bite you, and how?
I think first, Brock, I felt that I had some athletic ability, but the school that I went to didn't have a very good athletic program, so I was not able to participate or excel, let's say, to any degree. But growing up on the farm and working at the sawmill and around equipment, I learned to drive on the road when I was about 8 or 9 years old. Then my dad started taking me to some of the dirt track races around in this part of the country. North Wilkesboro and Charlotte had both had prominent dirt tracks. He was a big fan himself, and of course that sort of got me hooked. And if I'd go down in the pits after the race and could just get close enough to see those drivers, they were like gods to me. Boy, they were real heroes.
Who named me a couple of them in those days, Ned?
Buck Baker, Buddy Schumann, the Flock brothers were running back then, Bill Snowden, Curtis Turner was starting pretty strong then, Joe Weatherly, and drivers that I actually drove with sometime later because they had long careers, just started earlier than mine. Then when the Hickory Speedway, which is about 4 miles from right here, was being built, it was a big thing here in the county. Of course, it was a dirt track at that time, but everybody was going to become a race driver. And secretly, I decided that I was going to. And I did. I drove in that very first race. I bought half interest in a car that a friend of mine had, and ran in that very first race was ever run at Hickory Speedway. Did pretty well, I guess, considering that I had no experience, but a lot of people didn't have experience either. Finished 10th, I think it was. But after that race then, my dad sat me down and had a long talk with me. Even though he was a race fan, he didn't think that one of his sons should be out there participating in this rough and rugged sport of auto racing, because most of the participants back then were either considered to be a bootlegger or just a bunch of fools that didn't have any better sense than to go out there and risk their necks. Well, I was not a bootlegger, so I guess I fell into that other category. He said, well, know that you like the sport. I'm partly the cause of you liking the sport, but I'd rather that you just be involved as a car owner now that you own half interest in that car. Let your partner or someone else drive it. So we had a flourishing lumber business at that time, and the farm was going well. And my dad always worked very hard to build respect. That's one thing that he tried to instill in us, was to whatever you can do to try to build respect among the people that you're associated with. And he made the statement in that little talk that he just didn't feel that with the type of people that were involved in the sport that you could build the kind of respect that he expected. And I think that that presented one of the greatest challenges that I ever had once I got into the sport. But anyway, right after that, I respected his thoughts and wishes, and so my partner started driving the car, and he did pretty well, but one night several months later he got sick and was not able to drive the car, and I was about the same size as he, so we went out in the dark infield and changed shirts. I put on his and he put on mine, and we figured we'd get by the officials that way with the helmet on. They wouldn't be able to see your face anyway, so we did, and I drove the car and finished second. So we figured, well, I must be the best race driver because he never had done that well. And so we thought we had a plan that would work, and I continued to drive the car using his name, John Lentz, and finally won a race or two, but the word began to get around, and it got back to my dad. So he came to me one day. He said, if you're so determined to drive those things, you might as well use your own name and get any credit for any accomplishments that you may have along the way.
That's pretty special. You're a pretty special dad. He recognized that you really wanted to do that badly, huh?
Yes, he did, and I appreciate that very much. Of course, as time went by, he became one of my greatest fans, and he was a great influence on my life, which I appreciate. I just lost him within the last year, and he continued to be an influence right on down until his death. But he, other than playing a little baseball when he was in school, he had no athletic background and no other members of my family as far back as you go. So a lot of people have wondered, well, how in the world did you get started in auto racing? But that's the way.
So those words about keeping the Jarrett name clean and building respect around that name, based on your father's first conversation about you being a race driver, has really had an enormous influence on your life.
Yes, it has. I grew up in a Christian-like atmosphere, which I'm very proud of. And he, with the races being on the weekends, he was concerned that we might not be able to maintain that, which in turn would affect the image that we might be able to build over the years. But when he told me that he didn't see that you could build respect dealing with those people that you had to on a week-in, week-out basis, that was a great challenge for me, and still continues to be. Now that I do the radio and the TV work that I do, and perhaps my name is better known now than when I was actually driving the race car because of the mass media that's involved in the sport of auto racing today. So it has continued to be a challenge over the years, and it always flashes back. So I try to do things that will be good from those words that he said.
That's such a special way to approach a sport, and it's interesting that your family continues to carry on that tradition with your sons and your daughter and your wife, all of whom are, in a way, are associated with the sport. And I must say that they third generation is doing pretty well too, as far as respect for the Jarrett family is concerned.
Well, we're very proud of the boys and their approach to the sport, and they do approach it in a similar manner. I mean, they want to make a good name for themselves, realizing that they got to go out there and do the job themselves. They can't lean on me, or certainly the name that we have built up over the years can certainly be of some benefit to them in helping to open doors. But still, they got to get out there and do their thing themselves in order to build their own names and their own identity.
Ned, when I think about your career and what you brought to the sport, I can't help but paralleling it with a man that you know very well today, Junior Johnson. I'm sure that when your dad was talking about the so-called bad element of the sport, I'm sure he was thinking about Junior. Junior was the guy that represented that rough and tumble side of stock car racing in those days. You had a pretty hard go with him for a long time, but now things have changed.
Yes, they have, Brock, and thank goodness for the change. But at one time, he was as big an enemy as I could possibly have. It was a knock-down, drag-out type of a situation most of the time when we went to the racetracks, particularly on the short asphalts and the dirt tracks where you could really get in there and mix it up. But a lot of times we would just literally wear out a couple of 64 or 65 Fords on a given night on a 100-mile race. But now I do have the greatest respect for Junior Johnson. I consider him to be one of the best friends that I have in the sport of auto racing.
If you'd had a chance to talk to him in those days, you'd saved yourself a lot of bent sheet metal, huh?
Well, probably so, but we weren't on speaking terms back then too often.
Ned, you probably, I would say, certainly are the most articulate spokesman for the sport of Grand National Stock Car Racing and auto racing in many ways, through your television, your radio career. Tell me a little bit about what you see the future of stock car racing as over the next decade.
Brock, I feel even with the growth that we have had in the last decade in this sport, I feel that we have barely scratched the surface as far as the potential of this sport. As the competition increases, and what helps to increase that competition is all the major sponsors that are coming in now and putting the money there that it takes to go in a competitive manner, and I think that we'll see that continue with the exposure that they're able to gain through their efforts in the sport. So as that happens, the sport will become more competitive, and as it does, it's going to create more fans, and of course there is a very healthy crop of drivers that are coming along. The sport is very healthy from talent standpoint, and that is good. I think that we'll see a younger movement as time goes by. We're seeing it happen right now, and I think we'll continue to see that happen. But that is good because we'll see superstars that'll be born almost overnight, and you know, if they win, get big dollar bucks beside of their names, well, that helps to make superstars out of them. So I think that the sport is just going to continue to go up and up.
Ned Jarrett, I only hope that just a few of them can represent the sport as well as you have over the years. You've just been a marvelous representative, both as a driver and as a spokesman for Grand National Stock Car Racing, and we sure thank you for being with us today. And we thank you for joining us, along with Ned Jarrett, on The Great Drivers. I'm Brock Yates.